Hello. In this video we're talking about how to select appropriate models to use in our statistical analysis. And we need to think about this quite hard because there's a fundamental problem when we're doing model fitting exercises. And that problem is that a lot of the time we have lots of different potential explanatory variables that we could use. And we need to be able to answer the question of which of those explanatory variables should we include in our statistical model and which ones should we leave out. What we're aiming to do when we're fitting a statistical model is to produce the model that captures the essential elements of the relationships between our response variable and our explanatory variables, but which isn't any more complicated than is necessary. So we're trying to produce a description of how the patterns in our response variable are generated, which is general enough that we can draw useful conclusions from it, but which isn't more complicated than it needs to be. You'll sometimes see the kind of model that we're aiming to produce called a minimal adequate model. It is adequate to describe the patterns in the response variable, but it's the minimal model that is adequate to do that. When we're trying to generate a minimal adequate model, we need to bear three things in mind when we're constructing the sort of candidate models that we might be looking at. So, first of all, we have something that we might call the principle of economy of variables. Secondly, we need to do something called preserving marginality, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. And then finally, not so much a principle as a guideline, is we want to try and avoid something called multicollinearity. And again, we'll explain what that is in a minute. But let's start with economy of variables. Why do we not want more variables than we absolutely have to have in our model? Well, the answer is that as we add more variables into our model, as we add extra explanatory variables, the overall fit of our model might improve, but the usefulness of the model decreases. So a model with lots and lots of variables tends to lose generality, and you're losing that kind of overall perspective of what's going on in your data set and reducing it down to lots and lots of tiny details. And I can give you a cartoon example of this, a very extreme example. So here are some data. We have a variable called y1 and a variable called x1, and I've plotted them here so you can see that y1 isn't really related to x1 in any obvious way. Nonetheless, I can produce a model which describes this pattern exactly. So if I fit a polynomial model if I fit a fifth order polynomial model to these data, that fifth order polynomial model will produce a line that passes through every single value of y1. So it describes the relationship between x1 and y1 perfectly, but it tells us absolutely nothing. There's no generality in that model at all. So we don't want to have too many variables because we want to avoid this overfitting problem where we lose generality. And we also want to reduce the number of explanatory variables because that will actually make our analysis more powerful. Our model will be better able to detect the important effects that are going on if we have fewer variables than if we have more variables. So overall, when we're thinking about economy of variables, the first rule is simply that we want to use as few parameters as possible. We don't want any unnecessary variables included in our model. We want to use simple relationships between terms in our model. So we want to avoid using curved relationships, or we want to avoid fitting curved relationships when in fact a straight relationship will do. And we want to avoid using interaction terms when there's no need to use an interaction term. So if there's no support for using an interaction term in our model, we don't want to use that interaction term in our model. And on the basis of these principles, we can simplify some of the candidate models that we've got so that they only include the really important terms that describe the patterns in our response variable. So that's economy of variables. Next up, we have this thing called marginality. Marginality simply means that if you've got an interaction term in a model, you've really got to include the main effects in the model as well. So first of all, the main effects have got to come before the interaction terms in your model formula. Secondly, if you do have a statistically significant interaction term, then the main effects for the terms that are in the interaction term should be retained in the model. You can't have a model that's just an interaction term. You need the main effects also included in the model. And finally, you shouldn't really be testing your main effects for significance when you've got a statistically significant interaction term. This kind of makes intuitive sense. If the effect of one factor depends on the level of another factor, then asking whether there's an overall effect of that factor starts to become a bit meaningless. So statistical tests for main effects, when those main effects are also included in an interaction term in your model, are a bit meaningless, and we want to avoid them if we can. Okay, last of all, I said we need to avoid multicollinearity. Well, first of all, what is multicollinearity? Multicollinearity is a problem in fitting statistical models that can arise when your explanatory variables are strongly correlated with each other. And when this happens, it's essentially difficult for the model to distinguish between the effect of one variable and the other variable because they're both so similar. And what you end up with, for example, is a situation where both of your terms that are correlated with each other have very inflated standard errors. You can end up with a statistical model where the overall model is statistically significant, but none of the individual terms within the model are statistically significant. So it can cause problems with model fit, and that's essentially because both of those terms are so similar. They're both hoovering up the same amount of variance, and it's very difficult to distinguish between them. So in general, we want to avoid fitting models with strongly correlated explanatory variables. That's a general rule. It's not really a hard rule. Whether or not strong correlations between your variables are going to be important depends on a number of things, including the sample size. So there's no easy rule that I can give you. But in general, if you've got correlation coefficients between model terms that are bigger than about 0.8, then you need at least to bear in mind that that could be causing a problem with your model fit. Okay. So we've got some basic principles that we can use to build sets of candidate models, but then we have to ask the question of how can we distinguish between those sets of candidate models? How do we, if we've got a group of statistical models, what kind of process can we go through to decide on which model is our preferred model, or which models are our preferred models? And there's a number of different options for doing this. First of all, you can just use a computer to do it. You can plug your data into a computer and you can use an automated model selection algorithm. These usually come as either forward or backward stepwise approaches. So a backward stepwise model selection algorithm would start with a complex model and then carry out some kind of statistical test on the terms in those models, on the terms in that model, and remove the least significant term, and then run through the whole process again until it ends up with a model where all the terms are statistically significant. And a forward algorithm would start with a model with no explanatory variables and add them in and then retain them or not on the basis of whether or not they made a statistically significant difference to the fit of the model. So you can just use an automated model selection algorithm. Most people don't like automated model selection. There's some good reasons not to use it, although you will see it being used and you will find it as an option in lots of statistical software. First of all, it focuses purely on statistical criteria for including or excluding terms from your model. And as we'll see in a minute, sometimes there are criteria that aren't based on F ratios or p-values that we might use to include terms in our model or not. And another problem with automated model selection is that a lot of the time these different approaches that we can use give us different answers as to what's the best model. And then when we get different answers, we're going to have to make a subjective choice over which our preferred model is anyway. So given that we're going to be making that subjective choice there, that kind of takes away from any of the sort of benefits of using an automated system that might be found in the fact that what you're ending up with is a completely objective answer. So most people would recommend not using these automated model selection techniques, although you will come across them sometimes and you need to know about them, if for no other reason, so that you can avoid using them. What else can we do instead of automated model selection? Well, we can do non-automated model selection, where instead of just saying to the computer, find my best model, we go through our set of candidate models ourselves and we choose the best model on the basis of some criterion. And using non-automated model selection has quite a lot of advantages. If you just follow a rule when you're doing non-automated model selection, then you're basically doing the same as a computer algorithm and the same problems apply. But if you don't just follow a rule, if you think about what you're doing and you think about why you want particular terms in your model, then you can do things like you can retain terms in your model for reasons other than statistical significance, and we'll talk about that in a second. And you can do things like you can simplify your model by collapsing levels of factors that aren't different from each other, giving you a simpler factor. And again, I'll explain what that means in just a second. So let's start with the question of when we might want to retain terms in a model for reasons that aren't associated with statistical significance or some other criterion that we might use to decide on which terms stay in our model. So sometimes we want to include terms as statistical controls. And when we do that, we want to keep those terms in the model, whether or not they meet some artificial criterion of significance. So let's look at an example. Let's say you're studying the effect of lizard leg length on running speed, and you've caught a bunch of lizards, you've measured them, you've measured their body size, and you've made them run on a teeny little lizard treadmill to find out how fast they can run. So you could fit two different kinds of statistical models to your data. You could fit this model, where you've got running speed is explained by body size and leg length, or you could fit a model like this, where running speed is only explained by leg length. And if you have an effective leg length that you detect in one of these models, what that is telling you is going to be different between the two models. So in the first model, we fitted the effective body size before we fitted the effective leg length. So the effective body size will be partialed out of the data before the coefficient estimate for leg length is made. And so the first model is telling us not the effect of leg length, but the effect of relative leg length compared to body size. So the leg length term in the first model is telling us whether lizards with relatively long legs for their body size run faster or slower. The second model, which doesn't include body size, is telling us the absolute effect of leg length. So it's telling us whether lizards with long legs run faster or slower, but we're not worried about their body size. So those two things are telling us very different things. And if I were doing this experiment and I were interested in the effect of leg length, I would probably want to keep body size in my statistical model, whether or not it was significant, because I'm more interested in the effect of relative leg length than the effect of leg length overall. So we might want to retain terms in our model as statistical controls in that way. And the other thing we might want to do is retain terms in our model because they're an important component of the experimental design. So an example of this might be if we've done an experiment in a number of blocks, then a lot of people would argue that we should have block as a factor in our model, whether or not it meets any sort of criteria for inclusion in the model. So we should keep block in our model because it's a fundamental component of our experimental design, rather than because it meets some statistical criterion. So those are some reasons for retaining terms. The other thing I said you can do when you're choosing your model by hand is you can do things like collapsing factor levels to make your model simpler. And automated model selection algorithms can't do this. So let's say you've got three levels of a factor, levels A, B and C, and level A is highly significantly different from level B or C. So the mean of A is much bigger or much smaller than the means of level B and level C. But levels B and C are very similar in terms of their mean value. They're far from significantly different. What you can do in a situation like this is you can actually combine levels B and C to make a single level, and you've then got a 2-level factor rather than a 3-level factor, and then you can refit your model with your new 2-level factor, and that will now be a simpler model which will hopefully still do as good a job of describing the patterns in the data, and it will also be a slightly more powerful model because by reducing the number of levels in your factor you'll have increased the number of error degrees of freedom available, and that will make your model better able to detect effects when those effects are really there. Okay, so we've got some principles that we can use when we've got a set of candidate models, but how do we choose our initial set of candidate models? And again, there are a number of different options here. So the kind of equivalent here of the computerized algorithm that selects your models for you is an all subsets analysis, where you analyze all the valid combinations of variables and just choose the one that gives you the best fit. Then we have what some people might call enlightened model choice, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a minute. And then there's the kind of halfway house between enlightened model choice and other options that those of us who deal with real data and real field biology especially tend to use. So let's start with all subsets analysis. All subsets analysis means that you have a number of parameters that can go in your model, and you analyze all of the valid combinations of those parameters, bearing in mind the principle of marginality, and then you choose the one that's best. That can be okay if you've got a very small number of terms in your model. So when you've only got a few explanatory variables, this can be a useful approach. But as soon as you start adding extra terms into your model, it becomes very, very unwieldy. So if you have 4 terms in your model, for example, then if you're not interested in the interaction terms in your model, then you would have 16 possible models. If you are interested in the interaction terms between your explanatory variables as well as the main effects, then you would have 167 statistically valid models that would preserve marginality that you would then have to compare. And that's an awful lot of models that you're comparing. That's an awful lot of statistical tests that you're doing. All in all, it's not a very satisfactory way of choosing a set of candidate models to compare, just saying, well, we'll compare all of them and see which one's best. So what are the alternatives? Well, what some people might describe as enlightened model choice means that you select just a few candidate models and you choose these on the basis of, firstly, your existing knowledge of the system, and then secondly, on the basis of the actual hypothesis that you're trying to test. So if you've got a good idea of the specific question you're trying to answer, and if you haven't got a good idea of that question, what are you doing fitting statistical models? If you've got a good idea of the exact question you're trying to answer, and you've got a good understanding of the basics of how the system works, you can probably boil your set of candidate models down to 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 models, and you can use those to ask your questions. So let's look at an example of this. Once again, we're thinking about our lizards and their relative leg length and how fast they can run on our teeny tiny lizard treadmills. And let's say you've gone into the field, you've caught a bunch of lizards, you've measured how fast they run, and then you've got 4 possible explanatory variables. So you've measured their size, you've measured their sex, you've done the study in maybe 3 different locations, and then you've measured leg length. And you already know a bit about this system. You know that big lizards run faster. So you're not worried about testing for whether or not there's an effective size or not. And you know that there's a sex difference in how fast these lizards run. One sex runs faster than the other. So again, you're not particularly interested in testing whether there's a sex effect because you know there is one. Both of those variables probably need to go into our model because they are important in describing the variance in our response variable, but we're not particularly interested in testing whether or not there is an effect, because we know that already. Then we have our location variable, and this is like the block variable we were talking about earlier. This is a fundamental component of our design, so location should just go into our model again. So what we might do is compare a set of models looking like this. So first of all, we have a model which doesn't include leg length at all. So this is just including these terms, which we think we're going to include in all of our models. Then we have the same model but with the main effect of leg length added. And if we compare these two models together, that's going to tell us whether relative leg length does indeed have an important effect on the speed at which these lizards run. And then we know that there's an effect of sex on speed. We might think that there's a good chance that the effect of leg length on speed is different between the two sexes. And if we think that's possible as well, we might fit a third candidate model with all of those main effects and then the interaction term between sex and leg length as well. And then comparing those three models means that we're only comparing three models. Remember, we've got 4 explanatory variables here. So if we were to include all of the potential interaction terms, we would have 167 valid models that we could look at. But we've managed to boil that set down to just 3 models, and we're going to use those 3 models to ask some very specific questions about our data. So that's an example of what we might call enlightened model choice. And this is the kind of approach that's favoured by a lot of statisticians. So you should think hard about what it is you're doing, what you know about the system, and what questions you're asking. And then on that basis, you select a few candidate models and you compare them using some kind of criterion. So that was what we can call enlightened model choice. Sometimes, of course, we don't have a good understanding of the system that we're working on, and we have to ask questions about, well, what are the important factors that are contributing to the thing that we're interested in? And we have quite a lot of potential important factors that we don't know much about already. So this would be an exploratory study. And what we might do in circumstances like this is something like starting with the most complex model that we think is likely to actually be useful, and then we're going to reduce that model down on the basis of some sort of statistical criterion to try and produce our minimal adequate model. So we would remove terms from the most complex model that we think is likely to be important until we get a minimal adequate model. And let's just look at an example of the kind of thing where you might be following an approach like this. So let's say you're interested in what determines the height of some plants of a number of different species in your study area, and you've only just started looking at these plants and you don't know much about what actually determines their height. So you might go out and measure several different things that you think might be important in determining their height. So you're definitely going to want to know what species they are, but you might also be recording factors like how shaded an individual plant is, how much moisture is available to it, what the soil type is, whether it's a clay soil or a sandy soil, and you might be measuring some aspects of soil chemistry as well, such as nitrate availability. So you've got 5 different explanatory variables here, and then what you want to know is what combination of these explanatory variables gives us a minimal adequate model to explain the variance that we're seeing in the height of our plants. So you might start with a model where you've got all the main effects included. So we've got the main effects of our 5 potential explanatory variables. You know that species is going to be really important, or almost certainly going to be really important, but you also know that different species are likely to respond to some of these environmental variables in different ways. So on that basis, you might also want to include the two-way interactions between species and your other variables in your model, because you think that some of these at least might be important. And then you might have some a priori knowledge from another study that indicates that there might be an interaction between soil type and nitrate availability. So if the soil is sandy, nitrate availability has one effect, but if the soil is silty, nitrate availability has a different effect. So you might want to include the two-way interaction between soil type and nitrate availability then. And that's then giving you an initial model which is about as complicated as you might want to get, and then you're going to try and reduce that model down to produce a minimal adequate model. This is not as satisfactory a process as our Enlightened model choice, but as I say, sometimes when you don't know much about the system you're working on, you have to do this kind of exploratory analysis before you can start doing the sorts of studies where you can use that more precise Enlightened model choice approach. Okay, so we've talked about the fundamentals that we should use to build our models. There's some rules that we need to use to build our models. We've talked about the kind of procedures we can use to make choices between sets of candidate models, and we've talked about how we can generate those sets of candidate models. So the last thing to think about is, what are these criteria that we might use to choose between models once we've got a set of candidate models that we want to compare with each other? And this is where we start to really open the can of statistical worms. Essentially, there are two options for distinguishing between candidate models. There is a null hypothesis statistical testing based approach, and then there is an approach based on information theory. Some people would jump in here now and say, yes, what about Bayesian approaches? And I would say, yes, what about Bayesian approaches? This little video is too short for us to go into that. So we're just going to consider null hypothesis statistical testing based approaches and information theoretical approaches. So let's start with the null hypothesis approach. What you would do here is you would do something like take two nested, let's say you're comparing your set of candidate models. The way you can compare them is you would take two nested models. So for example, with our lizards, you might have that model and you might have this model. And then you would compare the two models using something called a partial f-test. And if you're fitting normal linear models as opposed to generalized linear models, then a partial f-test is the appropriate test to use. If you're using generalized linear models, sometimes you might want to use a different statistical test to compare them. But for the moment, let's just think about using a partial f-test. So you compare these two models using this test called a partial f-test, and if your p-value is less than 0.05, what you would say here is that the model with leg length has greater explanatory power than the model without leg length, so your preferred model would be the model with leg length included. This is kind of equivalent to getting the result that says, yes, there is a statistically significant effect of leg length in my model. If you're doing this in R, you can do it using the drop1 function and setting the argument test equals to test equals capital F in quote marks, and that will do partial f tests for you. So we can compare models using null hypothesis statistical testing. So basically we're saying, what are the statistically significant terms in our model, but we're doing it by comparing them using partial f tests. The other option is the information theoretical approach. There are a number of different information theoretical criteria that we can use. The most common one is one called AIC, which stands for Akeiki Information Criterion. Akeiki is named after Hirotogu Akeiki, a great Japanese statistician who first derived this principle. If I've mispronounced his name, I apologise to anyone that I might have offended by doing that. It's my best attempt. AIC is calculated as this, where K is the number of parameters in the model, so the number of explanatory variables, and L with a little hat is something called the maximum likelihood for the model. So AIC is 2 times the number of parameters minus the model maximum likelihood. And when we're dealing with AIC to compare models, then models with a lower AIC value are preferred. And if you think back to how it's calculated, you see that the more parameters we have in our model, the higher the value of AIC is going to be. So we've got something in our model that's an indication of how well the model fits. In this case, that's the maximum likelihood estimator, or the maximum likelihood value, or the log of the maximum likelihood value. I'll stop before I get more confused. So that tells us the fit of the model, and that's subtracted from the number of parameters. So the more parameters you have, the higher your AIC is going to be. The better your fit, the lower your AIC is going to be. So this is a value where we use the goodness of fit of the model, but it's penalized by the number of parameters in the model. So simpler models are preferred to more complex models. And what we do when we're using AIC to compare models is we compare the difference in AIC between the model with the lowest value of AIC and our other models. And you'll see this called the delta AIC. So the delta AIC is simply the difference in AIC between the models that we've fitted and the models that between the models that we're comparing. What AIC is actually telling us is something rather complicated. If you know anything about computational theory and information theory, you'll maybe be able to understand this. If not, don't worry about it. The difference in AIC between two models tells us how much information is lost between the model with the lower AIC and the model with the higher AIC. And that's information in the information theory sense, not information in the how much knowledge can I get from reading this page of a book sense. So we compare models on the basis of their delta AIC. So what's the difference between this model's AIC and the model with the lowest AIC in the set of models that we're comparing? And what we would say nowadays is that you should consider all of the models with a delta AIC of less than 6 as having some support as a good model to describe your data. You will see older literature on the subject saying that in fact you should use a delta AIC of 2, so you should consider models which differ in their AIC by 2 or less as being essentially supported in the same way. But nowadays there's been a bit more research on this, and I think people nowadays would say no, you should consider models as your top models that you need to consider when there's a delta AIC of less than 6. So if we're looking at our models for comparing the explanatory variables that might explain plant height that we talked about earlier, we might have a set of delta AICs looking like this. So height is explained by species and shading, is the model with the lowest AIC value, so that has a delta AIC of 0. And then we have a number of other models with slowly increasing delta AIC values. So the bottom model on that list with 4 explanatory variables, nitrate availability, soil type, shading and moisture, that has a delta AIC of greater than 6. So we would say that that model isn't in our top set. We're not going to consider that model any further as being a candidate model. Then we've got 2 other models which have values for delta AIC of less than 6. So we really have to consider all 3 of these models as being reasonably well supported as good models to describe what's going on in our data set. One thing you might see when you look at these models is that species features in all 3 of the models that are in the top set. So on that basis, we might say that we've got really good support for the idea that species is important in determining the height of our plants. We've got a couple of variables that are present in 2 out of the 3 models. So shading and soil type are present in 2 of the 3 models in our top set. So we might think that we've got some fairly good confidence that shading and soil type are important in determining height. And then nitrate availability only features in 1 model. Also, that's the model with the biggest delta AIC value of the ones in our top set. So we might say, and there's some evidence that nitrate availability is important, but we're not super confident about that. So that's the kind of interpretation that you'll sometimes see used with models when we're using AIC to compare them. One important thing to note is that AIC doesn't give you an absolute value for how well your model fits the data. It's only useful for making comparisons between models. So you might have a model with a lowest value of AIC that is actually a poor fit to your data, so long as the other models in your candidate set are worse. So you need to bear that in mind when you're dealing with AIC. It's a tool for making comparisons between models. It doesn't tell you how good your best model is at actually explaining the patterns in the data. So we've got these two approaches that I've mentioned. Which one should you use? AIC or null hypothesis statistical testing? This is the big can of worms. Lots of people have lots of opinions on this matter. Some of them will defend null hypothesis testing in model selection. Some of them will defend the use of information criteria in model selection. One thing I think that everyone would agree on is that you shouldn't mix and match the two. So if you're using AIC, then you probably don't want to be throwing in p-values as well. If you're using statistical testing to choose your models, then you shouldn't also use AIC to try and support what you've done with your statistical testing. I think most people generally would agree that both approaches are more or less valid. Given that people are arguing about this and have been arguing about it for quite a few years, it's unlikely that one of these approaches is so flawed that you simply shouldn't use it. So both of these approaches are probably really valid. And what I would say is use whichever one you're happier with. If this is the first time you've heard of AIC, then it might be a bit of a bridge too far at this moment in your statistical journey. Overall, it's more important to think carefully about model selection and how you interpret your models, how you think about what your model means, than it is to worry about whether you should be using AIC or p-values to do your model selection. Okay, thank you.